This is the painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware, Christmas night, 1776. It's in the American wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And if you have ever seen it, you know how incredible it is. It's at the end of a long gallery. It's enormous. It has a beautiful frame. And as you approach it, you can't help but being overwhelmed by its magnificence and its beauty. You can't help having an emotional reaction to it. Now, today, I'm going to talk about that crossing and why it's so important and why it's so iconic in our memories of the American Revolution. But I'm also going to talk about another part of the story. These are two graves that we find in a cemetery in Endicott, New York. Two graves of people I bet you've never heard of who are strategically connected to Washington's crossing in 1776. So ready? Here's our story. Now, the end of 1776 marks the end of a really miserable year for General Washington and the American Army. They have been losing every important engagement since the beginning of the year. They've gone into New York in the spring, and they've been beaten in New York. The prior November, Washington and his forces were finally driven completely off of the island of Manhattan with the Battle of Fort Washington. Now, if you're interested in more detail about those battles that have been going on since the spring of 1776 through the end of 1776, I have a playlist called Battle of New York, and you can see them all there step by step as each battle occurred. Now, at Fort Washington was an enormous loss for Washington. First of all, because he lost Manhattan Island. Now, he basically already lost Manhattan Island. This battle, some people have argued, should not have even taken place, that they shouldn't have even tried to defend this fort at the very northern tip of Manhattan Island. Now, this was not only a strategic geographic loss for Washington, but he lost nearly 3,000 men, 2,837 captured, 59 killed, and 96 wounded. Now, those nearly 300 captured were taken to British prisons for prisoners of war in Lower Manhattan or in the East River. And 18 months later, when it was time for a prisoner exchange, only 600 of them were still alive. It is a horrible loss for Washington. Not only that, they lost cannon, they lost munitions, and they lost much needed supplies to get them through the winter of 1776. Now, the only thing that year that prevented the British from realizing their full strategic plan for New York was Colonel Benedict Arnold. Remember, what the British are doing is they're setting up a forward operating base or a command base on Manhattan Island. Manhattan is easily accessible directly from the Atlantic Ocean through the harbor. Remember, the British have an incredible naval force in 1776. So they're going to take command of the harbor, the Atlantic Ocean, the East River, leading them out into the Long Island Sound, which they'll also command, and up the Hudson. Now, the British also have a base in Montreal. And what they're trying to do in 1776 is connect that base in Montreal with the base in New York by taking the Hudson and Lake Champlain, and then it's just a short distance overland to Montreal. That is their ultimate plan, to connect those two bases, and in doing so, creating a barrier separating New England from the rest of the colonies for the duration of the engagement, however long it will last. The only thing that kept them from achieving that was Benedict Arnold and the Battle of Valcour Island in the fall of 1776. And I'm not going to go into that battle here. I have a whole video about the Battle of Valcour Island that you can watch. That was the only thing that kept the British from realizing that strategic goal. On the other hand, Washington actually hasn't done that bad. He hasn't been defeated, right? He got out of New York with most of his army intact. Which was something the British also wanted to prevent. They did not want Washington to move into the interior of America because they weren't that familiar with it. The British are going to be naval based, at least for the beginning of the war, and all they know is the shoreline and some mileage to the interior. If Washington's men get too far into the interior, it's going to be difficult for them to fight. And of course, as the war goes on, we'll see that will proceed, and they will engage the help of some of the native tribes who are better at navigating the interior of the colonies, but that's all for another time. So end of 1776, Washington's army is somewhat intact. They've got out of New York. The British have Manhattan Island, they have the lower Hudson River, the East River, the Long Island Sound, but they do not have that connector from Montreal to Manhattan. Ironically, it's Benedict Arnold who prevents them from getting that. And you might remember in 1780, Benedict Arnold is going to offer them a way to achieve that. So very interesting turn of events as the years go by. Now, Washington has also faced challenges within his own army and Continental Congress, right? It's early in the war. We've never fought a war. There's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of uncoordination. There are men from some colonies who don't want to fight for a commanding officer from another colony. And it's been a difficult year on that front as well. There's also a problem that officers with more experience have had officers with less experience promoted above them in the last year. So that is creating a problem as well for the new command structure. Also, not to forget, at the end of the year, on December 31st, all of the enlistments will expire. And many of the men are just waiting it out for that last day so that they can pack up and go home, because really, the end of 1776, a lot of people believed it was already over and they might as well just go home and forget about it. And then a pamphlet is issued. On December, I think it's the 19th, Thomas Paine, who you might remember wrote Common Sense in 1776, begins a series called The American Crisis. And number one of The American Crisis comes out just before Christmas, 1776. Now, Paine himself has been traveling with the military, and he will, in his pamphlet, address some of the problems he's seen. But the part of the pamphlet that I bet you guys know is this part. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Here we go. The harder the door is to open, the more glorious the triumph, for the dog anyway. Don't get a dog who knows how to open all the doors in the home. And he goes on to talk about the conflict between loyalists and Tories, and that Tories are cowards and that they'll do anything for safety, even if it means giving up their freedom. I highly recommend you read it, and I'll link to it in the description of this video so you can read the whole pamphlet yourself, because it really is inspiring. So the story is that Washington has this pamphlet read to his men after, it's published, sometime after it's published and before the crossing. But Washington, by the time the pamphlet was published, had already been planning for this crossing across the Delaware River to attack the British or Hessian forces in Trenton. So where are we geographically now? Washington has been driven out of New York, right? He's out of Manhattan Island. He's crossed the Hudson River to New Jersey, and he's heading east and south down through New Jersey. And he's going to be driven across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. And that's where we are at the end of 1776. Washington is in Pennsylvania, and on the other side of the Delaware River are the Hessians and the British. When Washington gets the idea for an attack on the Hessians in a camp at Trenton. You guys know Trenton is a big city in New Jersey today, so at Trenton. Now they're going to cross, as you can see from the map, a bit north of where the Hessians actually are in Trenton. And that place is called Washington's Crossing today. So you can go visit that. And that's where they do the reenactment every year, which some of you may have seen. Now, if you don't remember, the Hessians have been with the British since the beginning of the Revolutionary War, and they are paid mercenaries from Germany. So King George, or the taxpayers of England, are paying for these soldiers to fight. It's an expensive fighting force, a fierce fighting force. And if you saw my video about the opening of the Battle of New York, the Americans were so terrified of Hessians, they actually thought at one point they couldn't be killed. And early in the battle for New York, some riflemen killed a Hessian and brought his body back to the camp to show everyone they could indeed be killed. So by the end of the year, they've been fighting Hessians and killing Hessians. Their view of them by the end of 1776 is much different from the beginning of 1776. They are not so fearsome anymore. Now, Washington figures out that the Hessians will be celebrating Christmas night. And that means that the next day they'll likely be tired and asleep from drinking and celebrating. And he identifies that as a great time to attack them. Plus, he needs to do something before those enlistments are up the last day of the year. He needs some sort of morale booster, not only for his men, but to show the Congress that they can win a strategic battle. So the plan is made that they will cross the Delaware Christmas night and then march. It's going to be, I think, about 3-hour march at around dawn or before dawn from where they cross down to the Hessian encampment at Trenton. And of course, helping us cross, we're going to find John Glover, Glover's regiments, or the Marblehead Mariners. Now, if you saw my video about the August 29th crossing of the East River in New York City, it's the same Marblehead Mariners, but there are some differences here, right? When they crossed in August, when they brought Washington from Brooklyn to Manhattan across the East River at night in August, it was summer. Now, the East River was wider and it was deeper and the currents were stronger. Well, maybe not. Currents might have been about the same, but the weather's better, right? If you fall off your boat in August, it's not likely you're going to, get hypothermia and freeze to death. Right? You're just going to be wet, but you're going to be warm. So it's a very different circumstance than going on in Christmas. And they were successful, obviously, in August. And I'll put a link to that video in the description here so you can hear all about the Marblehead Mariners. John Glover has been helping Washington strategically in a few battles, most notably that one of August 29th, the crossing of the East River, and then in October in Westchester, the Battle of Pell's Point. And I will put a link to the video about Pell's Point in here too, because that is really one of my favorite things that Glover's regiments do is Pell's Point. You really should watch that and just hear about how a very small fighting force was able to hold off a far superior force just by being strategically smarter. It's a really great story about the Battle of Pell's Point. But back to Washington's Crossing. So we're going to find our friends John Glover and the Marblehead Mariners again doing a crossing of a river at night. Now, if they can pull this off, if they can get everyone across the Delaware that night dry so that they can then march to Trenton, surprise the Hessians, beat them there, have a victory, they will have a great booster, right? As I said before, a morale booster, something to show the Continental Congress that it's worth trying to keep going, it's worth the money, worth all of the difficulty, and it also will cap off a year of terrible losses with an inspiring victory. So that's what we're going for, Christmas night, 1776. This is what makes the story so iconic, that an army that has been beaten and beaten and beaten down for a year can get itself together and have this rousing victory. The bravery and courage that it took to do this. This is the beginning of what we call the American spirit, right? That no matter how many times you fail, you don't give up, you keep going. Can't tell you how many times I record some of these videos and I hate them all, but I keep going until I get the video the way I think it will be best for you. So that's just part of our spirit as Americans, is to just keep going until we get the victory we want. And you see that born here in the American Revolution and especially at Washington's Crossing. Now, before we get to the actual logistics of the crossing, we're going to take a side detour to that graveyard in Endicott, New York, which is also related to this graveyard in Staten Island, New York. And you notice the name on the graves is Mesereau. Well, who are these guys? The Mesereau family settled in Staten Island in the late 1600s. They were French Huguenots, and they became a very successful family. Joshua Mesereau attended King's College, right, Columbia University, so he became a lawyer. His brother John was a businessman. They had a farm. They had a tavern, the Blazing Star Tavern. And in 1770, so 5 years before the war started, right, they started something they called the flying machine. Now, the first time, here's an ad for the flying machine. The first time I saw a newspaper ad for the flying machine, I said, what? What's a flying machine? They couldn't fly in 1770. Well, what it is it's a coach from New York to Philadelphia that moves so fast, it's like flying. It's the flying machine. But it's not just any type of coach. It's a stagecoach. The Mesereau brothers invented the stagecoach, which was a coach that ran from New York to Philadelphia in stages. I think it went New York to Trenton and then Trenton to Philadelphia. I think Trenton was the stop in between. I'm not 100% sure. So the first stagecoach. So these guys are innovators. They're wealthy, they're making money, they're very popular on Staten Island, they're doing really well. And the Revolutionary War comes along. And the first spot in New York City to be occupied by the British was Staten Island. Now, you might remember at the end of 1775, the Americans went to Canada to fight in Montreal and Quebec. At that time, Joshua Mesereau gave all of the family horses to the Continental Army, and he raised a company of men for that later attack on Quebec, led by Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold. When the British arrived on Staten Island in 1776, so that's after the Battle of Quebec, right, the end of 1775. Then in spring 1776, the British arrive on Staten Island. Well, the Mesereau brothers are enemies of the military, right? They already know who they are, and they're enemies. Part of the family is going to flee to New Jersey with a bounty on them by British forces. So they flee to New Jersey, and they don't stop there. Some of them become officers in the Continental Army, and some of the Mesereaus form a spy ring, the Mesereau spy ring. And that spy ring is going to operate from the time the British land in 1776 in Staten Island right through the end of the war in 1783. It is a massive spy ring. I don't think anyone knows who all of the operators were. It also included military officers, civilians, people from Staten Island, New Jersey, and all the way along the west side of the Hudson River. Now, I know some of you probably know about the Culper spy ring that operated from New York City or Manhattan out to Long Island and up on the east side of the Hudson, while the Mesereaus worked the other side of the Hudson. And in 1777, Washington wrote a letter to Congress proclaiming that he had spies right in the British command who were sending him information. And that is likely the Mesereaus, because I think that letter predates the start of Benjamin Talmadge Culper spy ring. So now let's get back to our story of Washington's crossing. So early in December 1776, the Mesereau brothers are down there, poking around. And for some reason, they know about this plan. There's a lot of espionage going on at this time on both sides. So somehow they know this crossing is in the works, and they're poking around the Delaware River. And what do they find? They find some boats that have been sunken by the British in the event that Washington does cross from Pennsylvania to New Jersey, that they can use those boats to pursue him. And what do the brothers do? They destroy the boats. They wreck the bottom of the boats, put holes in them, right, and sink them right back in there where they can't be used. And the Mesereaus then went on to claim that they were part of the success of the attack on the Hessians at Trenton, because the British in Pennsylvania could not follow them. Now, they are not the only spy at work in this. There's another spy named John Honeyman. John Honeyman, a patriot, pretended to be a loyalist. He was denounced by his family and his town, chased out of town, denounced as a traitor. Washington actually put out word that if this traitor Honeyman was captured, he should be brought to Washington alive, because Washington himself wanted to oversee the hanging of this man. So the few times Honeyman was caught and brought to Washington, he, told him what he knew, and somehow his escape was always facilitated. I think in one instance, he was in a stockade and oops, a fire broke out somewhere. Everybody who was guarding him ran off and he got away. And this continued. So Honeyman was not only picking up information for Washington, but he was getting into the Hessian camp and lying to them about the strength of Washington's forces, telling the commander there, Colonel Rahl, that, these guys aren't going to attack you. They're in total disarray. Washington lost all these men at Fort Washington. He's got this, this mutiny going on with his guys. They've got no money. They've got no food. You don't have to worry about anything. These guys will never attack you now. So this is John Honeyman. Now, this facade was so successful that a bunch of patriots went to Honeyman's home looking for him. And his wife pulled out this note that she showed them. And it says, "It is hereby ordered that the wife and children of John Honeyman of Griggstown, the notorious Tory, now within the British lines, and probably acting the part of a spy, Washington must have had a good laugh when he wrote that. Shall be and hereby are protected from all harm and annoyance from the public until further orders. This furnishes no protection to Honeyman himself. So in other words, a letter from Washington saying, leave his family alone. They're no part of this. He's a despicable person and don't bother them, but let him be and we'll deal with Honeyman ourselves. It's believed that when Washington actually, after they crossed and they marched into the camp at Trenton, that Honeyman was still there and made his escape just in time, of course, because he didn't want to be anywhere near Colonel Rahl when Rahl realized he lied to him. But there's a little twist to that story because Rahl isn't going to be around to see John Honeyman there. So let's get back to the Washington part of the story now. So now we all know the story as depicted in the great painting, right? The Marblehead mariners get the boats together, they build the boats, they're ready to go, and they transport everyone across the Delaware River after sunset on Christmas night. This includes quite a few pieces of artillery that General Henry Knox brought with him. You might remember Knox was good at moving artillery in the winter. He moved all that artillery from New York to Boston in the winter of 1775-76. So they have artillery pieces, munitions, horses, men, and they get everything across successfully. And then they take their march to Trenton, where they surprise the Hessians and have a victory. Now, there's espionage on the other side, too. So on the other side, there are British spies working too. And locally on the Pennsylvania side, there's a Tory who is watching Washington and figures out that they are going to cross that night and go to Trenton. And he goes to the Hessian camp. And I don't think Rahl and the guys are in the camp at this time. They might be at somebody's inn or something. I'm not sure exactly where they are. But this guy shows up and he says, I want to talk to Colonel Rahl because the Americans are going to cross and attack him in the morning, and he can't get to him. The best he can do is give a note to one of the servants. So the servant gives the note to Rahl. Rahl puts it in his pocket. And you know what? You're going to find that note the next day in Colonel Rahl's pocket as he lays dead, killed in the assault by Washington's men. Incredible story, right? So, of course, Washington has that victory the day after Christmas, 1776, is that victory at Trenton. It's an incredible victory for those men who had gone through so much the winter of 1776. Not as bad as the next winter, 1776, but still pretty bad. So Washington got his victory, and most of the men buoyed up by this victory re-enlisted for the year 1777 and went on to also be successful in the January 3rd Battle of Princeton. Now, the British call the year 1777 the year of the hangman because, if you write those sevens, they look like little gallows lined up because they believe that that was the year they were going to hang all of those American traitors, the year of the hangman. But hey, the end of 1777 is going to roll around and the British have still not beaten the Americans. Thank you very much for watching. Happy New Year. Happy 2025. I have a lot of great videos planned for you this year, so please subscribe to my channel. And if you have friends who you think are interested in these American history stories, please share them, like them, and until next time, I'm Mrs. Q.